Hello. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rafaela, and I work for UNESCO. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the pre-launch of UNESCO's publication, More Than Welcome, Intercultural Integration of Migrants in and Through Higher Education. Today marks a significant moment as we come together to discuss how higher education institutions can foster environments that support migrant students and promote intercultural understanding in ways that benefit our communities and society at large. To begin our program, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Ewan McAvoy-Jones, who's a program specialist for inclusion, rights, and intercultural dialogue for UNESCO. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ewan to the stage.
So thank you very much, Rafaela. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here, to see so many friendly faces in the audience. And welcome to this, which is our launch of the new publication with UNESCO, More Than Welcome. We have a lot of thanks to give at the start. So I'd like to start by thanking Dala, of course, Professor Dala Dedaf, who's our UNESCO chair in intercultural competences here at Stellenbosch, who has been leading the research for this publication, leading the drafting, and we have a big gratitude to her for all the commitment and the expertise that she's given towards the publication. I also want to thank Stellenbosch for hosting us today, to Werner in particular for all the hard work in putting together the event. I think it's testament to the fact that Stellenbosch is so committed to these themes that we're here today, and I think it's really great to have this global conversation in an institution with such commitment and investment in these important issues. I want to thank the panelists who are going to be joining us shortly. It's great to have people from all corners of the world here with us. It's going to make the conversation really global today, really interesting, really engaging. So really thanks for being with us. And last but certainly not least, thanking the Lumina Foundation, who have supported all of this work financially, who are very committed to educational equity, educational inclusion, share a real alignment with UNESCO on these important issues, and we're really grateful for the partnership with them. Of course, these issues and this work is more important than ever before. We've seen crises over the last few years which have brought global displacement to unprecedented levels. As of 2024, there's 117 million people uprooted across the world by conflict, environmental disaster, economic instability. And even though we see institutions like this doing such great work in welcoming everybody, but I think there's lots of places around the world where that hospitality, that same support is not a given, and there's a lot of work still to be done. The latest figures from the Migration Acceptance Index by Gallup showed an unprecedented decline globally in levels of acceptance for migration. And it's exactly against this backdrop of anti-migrant sentiment that we need to rethink how we conceptualize, how we approach integration. Societies are becoming more interconnected, and so too are the responsibilities to ensure that migration is not perceived just as a challenge to manage, but also as a tremendous opportunity for human development, for social cohesion, and of course, for economic growth and inclusion as well. And the numbers really confirm that this is a reality. A 2021 study by OECD found that immigrants contributed more in taxes than governments spent on social protection, health, and education combined. And recent estimates have valued the contribution of migrants to public goods globally at around $570 billion, which is quite a figure. But of course, achieving these outcomes requires more than welcoming migrants just at our borders. It requires an active effort to create environments in which they can flourish. And to unlock this potential, society must move beyond models of integration which place the responsibility solely on migrants, the burden solely on people who are on the move, to new paradigms of multi-directional intercultural integration, which really involves all members of communities. And this concept of intercultural integration is something that we outline in the publication, building on principles of mutual engagement and shared responsibility. And it places as much importance on host communities and institutions, and of course educational establishments as well, as it does on newcomers arriving in that process as well. And it's a two-way process which fosters mutual respect and deeper understanding, and ultimately this shared feeling of belonging which can help to strengthen the social fabric within our societies. The publication, More Than Welcome, illustrates that higher education institutions are really strategically positioned to advance this model of intercultural integration, and they have an important potential to serve as agents of social transformation in this regard. By fostering environments of mutual respect, of understanding, of collaboration, they can help to dismantle xenophobia, cultural discrimination, impacting not only students and staff with whom they directly work, but also impacting the communities and the wider societies that they serve and exist within. And yet, despite this huge potential, there's still big challenges, and the challenges are indeed formidable. Only a small amount of refugees, around 3 to 5%, are able to access higher education globally, and that's a figure that, of course, pales into comparison to the global enrollment rates in higher education of around 38%. And the publication's framework seeks to address these disparities in a practical way, providing policymakers, providing educators with the tools to remove barriers and overcome discrimination, and really embrace cultural diversity and pluralism within all of the work of the institutions and the impact that they have beyond the institutions themselves as well. More Than Welcome introduces an actionable framework which is grounded in 5 core principles that any institution can adopt to promote intercultural integration, both for the benefit of migrant learners and, of course, for wider society as well. It's designed to be really practical. It's designed to offer strategies and real-world examples that can demonstrate how these educational institutions can lead the way in building more resilient and inclusive communities. And it calls upon universities to not only educate, but also to engage, to actively participate in the communities and the societies that they serve, and help to champion this legacy of openness and intercultural engagement. So I'm really happy that we have all our speakers today. They're going to delve into the details of the framework in a lot more detail, and I think that's going to be really beneficial for us all to learn how to use these recommendations that the publication outlines to help champion the role of higher education institutions within this really important issue, really important mission. So thank you again for being here. Really happy to see so many people here, and I know there's lots more connected online as well, and excited for the conversations we're going to have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Next, we are honored to have with us Mr. Robert Coetzee, Senior Director of Stellenbosch University International, whose leadership and dedication to education have fostered an inclusive environment right here at Stellenbosch. Thank you to Stellenbosch University for hosting us today and for your commitment to advancing intercultural dialogue and education. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. It's really indeed a pleasure for me to be here today and to welcome all of you to Stellenbosch and to the university and to this event. I always say that at any event you always think about the people, the place, and the possibility that's out there for us as a collective. And if we talk about the people, I would especially like to welcome Sara Habibi, who will be our keynote speaker, and then Darla. Dr. Deerdorf is associated with Stellenbosch University as the chairholder. Darla, welcome. I'm very happy that we not only see you on the screen, on the Zoom, but that you've zoomed in and that you are here with us. Welcome also to that's a wrong word, to fellow UNESCO chairholders and from the different environments and the universities in the Western Cape and also from overseas. And then I see also a lot of known faces from the university, but also from Stellenbosch University International banner, which I will say is rent a crowd. But it's good to have you here and to see that you also share your time to get experiences, to get more knowledge, and also to engage with people on the topics. Now, if we talk about place, the chair is within Stellenbosch University International. Now, what has an international office to do with research? But the chair is more than just research, it's a think tank on the important issue of intercultural competences. Within Stellenbosch University International, we are really committed to ensure that that old Jane Knight definition of internationalization, that it happens. It's about an integration of an intercultural, international and global dimension into all aspects of the university. So what do we do? Firstly, you have to start at home. And we really have challenges around even just integrating international students within the local community. But we also have challenges to integrate the international students within their own cohort, because the degree-seeking students, international degree-seeking students from Africa, often think they do have less services than the semester students who are from Europe, black, white. And that is many times based on a wrong understanding and a wrong reading of what is available. So you have to start at home when you want to talk about intercultural integration, and that is a first and wonderful task for us within SU International. But we don't want to welcome the known, but we also want to more than welcome the immigrants, the refugees, and the displaced people. So from our side, we're a bit late in the game, but we are considering setting up a support service for students and staff from what we are known as the RDP communities, the refugees and displaced people communities. We are part of a network, the African Higher Education in Emergencies Network, hosted at the University of Nairobi. And we're part of a MasterCard Foundation project where we will have support to create a support environment for refugees at the university, but more importantly, through our teaching and learning division, especially learning technologies, to create courses and to create programs for online access to students with an RTP background. Then we are also involved in a project from the University of Oslo. It's still in the scoping phase regarding setting up a global university college, especially to address the large refugee community within Uganda in terms of the Sudan crisis that we have. And then, of course, there's Scholars at Risk and other similar initiatives to deal with staff and researchers who are affected. So the place where this chair is trying to do something about it, and we are embarking on what I hope is a very productive road for us at Stellenbosch University International. So, Sara, possibility. So what is the possibility of this event? The possibility is for us to hear what is possible and where we can become involved and to contribute as higher education to the intercultural integration of migrants and to contribute to their success and to contribute to them also having a good education and entering into a new society. So I more than welcome you, and I more than hope that the panel will give us good input. We need to read the report first, Nedala, and that we will have the possibilities and see the opportunities where we can make a contribution. Lastly, thank you to the Lumina Foundation and for your engagement. And let's look forward to what the clever people what they have to say to us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Coetzee. Now we're very grateful to have with us Dr. Sara Habibi, who's a specialist in peace building through education at UNITAR. With over 20 years of experience as a practitioner, researcher, curriculum developer, and trainer, she holds an MPhil and PhD in education from the University of Cambridge and has worked with governments and the UN on issues related to intercultural understanding for peace building in the Western Balkans, the Middle East, East Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Please join me in welcoming Miss Sara Habibi Clark.
Esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, partners in education, thank you for this opportunity to contribute a few opening reflections at the launch of this pivotal publication, more than welcome, co-authored by Professor Darla Dirov, UNESCO Chair for Intercultural Competence here at Stellenbosch University, together with Rafaela Juliana, who you just saw on stage, and Ewan McWay-Jones from UNESCO, and of course with the contributions of many other cherished contributors and specialists. I'll keep my remarks short because I think there will be a much more interesting exchange with the other panelists who come to follow in the program today. And also, of course, Ewan has already given a kind of an important overview to what this new publication actually puts forward. As he was saying, as highlighted in the publication, we're really facing persistently, dangerously high levels of migration due to conflict, environmental disasters, and economic challenges. And I'm afraid to say that by all indicators, these challenges are going to continue to increase. And so we're looking at generational challenges. We have to think in not only in the short term, we must think by generations. We must think, what are we doing now that will have impact in 1, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. This is the policy and practice challenge that we're trying to address today and in the conversation stemming from this publication. In particular, the focus of our deliberations and of this publication launch is on, of course, the role of higher education institutions and how we can augment the good work that's already been done in internationalization, but to take greater consideration of issues of inclusion and equity to respond to the educational and professional needs of migrants and displaced learners. And of course, all of the impact that these capable individuals have in their professional and social spheres. The institutions of higher education are a seedbed of the innovators, researchers, thought leaders, family leaders, community leaders of the future. How do we welcome and integrate and benefit from the presence, however temporary or enduring, of these populations that come into our institutions to enrich them and to benefit from them? So my purpose today is not simply to commend this publication, but also to launch this critical reflection with you on how it fills some important gaps in education governance, in curriculum development and teaching and research, and in the communities that we create in our institutions. And I'll try to highlight a few open questions that are raised by this publication, questions that UNESCO invites us as policymakers and educators and practitioners to deliberate upon together if we are truly to transform our institutions into inclusive, welcoming, and creative and innovative spaces for migrant and refugee children. So I won't repeat the statistics. As we're seeing with the low enrollment rates of students who are displaced and displaced populations who are seeking higher education, we realize that it's not just a matter of policies that have not adequately prioritized or resourced inclusive access for displaced learners. We also need to consider, as has been said, how do we create spaces where Migrants and refugees know that there are services, feel that they belong, and can thrive in these environments so that we can promote within and through our institutions increased social cohesion, community resilience, co-creation of knowledge, new epistemological models, innovation, and social and economic development. By neglecting these issues, we miss opportunities. That's the key. We're missing the opportunities of this incredible resource of people who would have contributed their knowledge and expertise in their home countries, and now they're coming here. What an opportunity we have. This is a gift, but it's also a responsibility and a challenge. So how do we take care of that, both from an institutional side, but also from the human side? And this is where we come into some of those open questions around what labels are we using? What categories are we creating? Are they helpful ones? Are they not helpful ones? Who do we call a migrant? I'm also a migrant, but I'm not that profile that maybe we're thinking of. And maybe I'm not the profile that is the intention of our conversation today. So what do we call a migrant? What do we mean by that? And are we using these words in helpful ways or not? Is it creating more barriers than there needs to be? Or are these important labels that we need in order to be able to address specific services, policies, opportunities? So we need to not take these terms for granted. We need to open them up. More Than Welcome, as a publication, makes a critical contribution in this regard, because UNESCO and the chair here are uniquely positioned to have a global audience. And this is really important, to have the conversation going. It also provides a structured framework for thinking above all. Yes, it includes recommendations. Yes, it includes benchmarks and indicators of success. But more importantly, I feel, is it articulates thoughtful and critical questions for policymakers, for curriculum developers and faculty members, for university administrators and students themselves. And one of the first questions we need to ask ourselves is, who should answer those questions? Should I answer those questions for you? Because I'm a foreign visitor? No. We all need to be looking at those questions together. We need to be sitting in different spheres, in different spaces, inviting people to the table. Students themselves, refugees themselves, community members themselves, thinking about what are the implications for our institutions. How do we shift mentalities, but also processes of this one-sided integration, traditional approach to integration, to exactly what the publication is advancing, which is multi-directional processes of integration, adaptation, and learning. This is no small task, for sure, but as you will see, and as Ewan has already mentioned, it puts forward actionable principles. These 5 actionable core principles: shared responsibility, reciprocity, inclusivity, civic and human rights education, and active citizenship, or global citizenship, or a reconceptualization of what does it mean. This is one of those key terms that needs some picking apart. These are filling some of the gaps and also giving us directions that we can move in to develop our understanding of our institutional responsibilities as well as our personal role in fostering intercultural institution. I mentioned this thing about citizenship being problematic, of course, because as was mentioned by the previous speaker, international students often don't realize or don't presume that services apply equally to them. And this is, of course, true for migrants and refugees who are not citizens. They are people without states. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have access to the same services. They may not even have linguistic access to the services that do exist for them. And therefore, how can we foster agency among people who, by definition, have lost their capacity or lost their rights to influence the system in which they were existing and are now existing? This is a very important point. And universities, by virtue of being mini countries, have their own opportunity to precisely create those spaces for agency among displaced persons and to give them the opportunity to develop their capacities to be agents of change, whether they stay in the host country, move on to another host country, or indeed return to their home countries. And that's another open question. Where are these students coming from and where are they going? What are we preparing them for and where? So that raises, of course, lots of policy issues around the recognition of qualifications, around the development of curriculum, around our own concept of our nation state. A lot of countries resist bi-directional integration because they see migrants and refugees as a temporary issue to deal with. And of course, that's a myth. That's false. That's false because they end up staying, we end up staying in our places of welcome, and our children are born there, and their children are born there, and yet the system hasn't accepted our presence. How do we do with that? So we have to also ask ourselves, for which society are we preparing our graduates, whether refugees or not? And that's an attitudinal question. That's an attitudinal question for all students, for our institution. What is the social role? What is the civic role of our institution? What world are we creating? And you don't have to turn on the television today to be reminded that education is key to the destiny of the world. It's serious. So this publication invites us, encourages us, guides us to reflect on these questions, and it links to other very important work that has been done by people in the room, by UNESCO, that links internationalization in higher education to notions of the public good. A public good which is accessible to all, which is key to international cooperation and solidarity, which is intimately tied to promoting peace, human rights, and solidarity, preventing violent conflict, and all of its other forms of violences and abuses beyond the scope of war, and for addressing global north-south, quote-unquote, inequalities in both access to and the production of knowledge. So I will wrap up perhaps some of my thoughts so that we can leave space for the panelists to explore these questions further and to give some good examples, which are also, by the way, highlighted in this wonderful publication. There are wonderful case studies as well, which you will discover. It offers, as I said, a robust framework for critical reflection and opens up questions around how do we define these terms, how do we operationalize them, and how are we going to monitor the success of our efforts to foster intercultural integration in our institutions. We need accountabilities, because it's all well and good to talk good words, but if we're not actually following up with action and not tracking that action and learning from it and asking ourselves, has it been adequate? What impact has it had? What should we be doing differently in a constant learning cycle? Then we can't expect to make much progress. So we need to also think about how do we meaningfully measure success in cultivating intercultural integration? Who do we count? Who do we invite to speak? What indicators do we look for? What processes do we put in place? That's also another key consideration. For sure, the success of the reflections raised by this publication will depend on our commitment here today and internationally to act upon the recommendations. It requires a lot of vision, courage, I would dare say, because traditions don't die easily. So that requires leadership and moral courage to do things differently. It requires, of course, policy development, lots of planning, curriculum development, service delivery, community engagement, and above all, cultural change, because that is the lever that makes the rest possible. And that requires an institutional, but also a very personal reflection on how can we use our opportunity, our privilege, our influence. Higher education is so privileged. How do we use our privilege to make a difference? And I ask you, how will your institution respond to this call to action? What concrete steps are you willing to take from this day forward, to have those conversations, to move this discussion towards implementation. As we collectively navigate the future of higher education, let us ensure that it reflects not just the diversity of our student bodies, but the richness of their potential, and that it lays the foundation for them to move into the world, to whatever destination or destinations, to continue making it better, more accessible, more equitable, more just, please, less violent for everyone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara, and thank you to all our distinguished speakers for their insights and for setting the stage for our discussions. We will now move into the panel discussion, which will explore the key themes of More Than Welcome. So as we heard, this publication presents a framework for intercultural integration, emphasizing how higher education institutions can lead the way in fostering inclusion and understanding. So moderating our panel is the author of More Than Welcome, Professor Darla Derdorf, and she will introduce the panel and guide us through discussions on how higher education can serve as both a pathway and a platform for intercultural integration. Dr. Derdorf is the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair on Intercultural Competences at Stellenbosch University. In addition, she's a research fellow at Duke University and holds several other faculty appointments at universities around the world, including in Japan, China, and Canada. Joining us at this panel, there are also 4 distinguished experts who bring unique perspectives to the conversation. Professor Fethi Mansouri, the UNESCO Chair for Comparative Research on Cultural Diversity and Social Justice, and Professor of Migration and Intercultural Studies at Deakin University in Australia. Professor Mansouri is the founding director of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University and serves as an expert advisor to various UN agencies and regional bodies on cultural diversity, migration, racism, and intercultural relations. And if you want to start coming on stage, so we can welcome him. Then we have Professor Kasaija Philip Apuli, who is a professor of politics in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. He has been a British Academy visiting scholar at African Studies Centre, the University of Oxford, and Fulbright Scholar in Residence, Stetson School of Law in Gulfport, Florida, US. He has also served as a conflict prevention, management, and resolution advisor at the Intergovernmental Authority on Development Secretariat in Djibouti. Professor Kasaija has published widely in the areas of international law, conflict, and regional integration in Africa. So a big round of applause to welcome him on stage. Then we have Professor Veronica Boyce-Mansilla, who's a senior principal investigator at Project Zero, Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's an international expert on global and intercultural education. Her frameworks and tools, including the new Reimagining Migration Framework, have advanced quality interdisciplinary, global, and intercultural education in high-impact institutions such as AFS International, Asia Society, International Baccalaureate, National Academy of Sciences, National Gallery of Art, OECD, the Smithsonian Institutions, and UNESCO. So welcome her on stage, please. And then last but definitely not least, we have Professor Fumane Portia-Canare, who's an associate professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. In 2017, she was recognized as a Child and Youth Institute Laureate by the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. She also co-convened the International Youth Exchange Project titled Participate South Africa, Germany, and Zimbabwe, promoting youth participation in SGD 8. Decent work and economic growth among marginalized communities. Prof. Canare is the current chairperson of the Education Association of South Africa. So we can welcome her on stage. Now I'm going to leave the floor to Darla, who's going to moderate the panel, and thank her again for this wonderful work and the great publication. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafaela. And good afternoon to you all, and good afternoon to those joining us online. I understand we're joined by over 100 colleagues from around the world online, and so we're grateful for their presence as well as all of you who are here in the audience today. And an exciting day it is, especially a very timely day, to be launching this publication on intercultural integration for migrant learners in higher education. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words about this UNESCO chair here at Stellenbosch. It's one of 2 UNESCO chairs currently here at Stellenbosch, and this is the only chair on intercultural competence of the 1,000 or so that exist around the world. And we're relatively new here at Stellenbosch. We're in our 2nd year. And in terms of hosting this event today, we're very happy to be able to host our colleagues from UNESCO Paris. So thank you very much for your leadership and guidance, and also our keynote speaker from Geneva. And really appreciate you being here. And in terms of the chair's work here at Stellenbosch and across South Africa and the continent, this chair is very keen to identify and elevate African voices, perspectives, and practices around intercultural competence, particularly those practices that may have existed pre-colonial. And this is a huge gap currently in the intercultural field for those of you who are familiar with it, because so much of this work has come from the global north. And we are deeply committed to making sure that it's time for African voices and perspectives to be heard in this area as well. And to that end, our research areas include looking at the intersections of intercultural competence in 3 of the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and those being peacebuilding, gender equality, and climate action. And we invite all of you to join us in the work of this chair through research and capacity building. Thanks to many of you who joined us in the UNESCO Story Circles Train the Trainer earlier today here in this room. This is one of our main capacity building efforts that we hope to take across South Africa and the continent and beyond. And we are also very excited to have just participated in our inaugural intercultural conference on this continent that was hosted at our partner university, Strathmore, in Nairobi 2 weeks ago, and we're looking forward to next year's 2025 Intercultural Conference, which will be in Rabat, Morocco, the last week of September, and you are all warmly invited, including those of you online. So again, we're very thrilled to be able to host this pre-launch event of this very important publication on intercultural integration, which, as you've heard from our speakers previously, is needed now more than ever. And just a word about the publication. You have a flyer about it. This is the front cover, and you'll see a summary on the back. This will be available in the near future online. And so do be watching for it. If you've registered for this event, you will receive a link when it's available online. It does feature 4 chapters. The first one outlining much of the context that you've heard about, as well as challenges faced by vulnerable populations in higher education, including not just financing and language, but also xenophobia and trauma. And it does propose, I think, a unique multi-directional approach to intercultural integration, where, as you heard, it's on all of us, not just on our students, to engage in this integration process. The second chapter examines what higher education institutions can do. So it's focused more on the institutions themselves, around interculturally integrating migrant learners and vulnerable populations into the institutional community, while the third chapter looks at what can be done through institutions into the local communities and the world of work. And then finally, the fourth chapter does include a series of recommendations targeted particularly to policymakers and those involved in educational policy in terms of promoting and ensuring intercultural integration within and through these institutions. Throughout the publication, you will find different examples and case studies to make it very practical and usable. We hope you'll be able to make use of it. As we all have that responsibility for interculturally integrating all students within our institutions. As you've heard, More Than Welcome offers a pioneering framework for intercultural integration founded on 5 core principles that came out of the research. Intercultural competence being at the heart of all 5 principles. And as you've already heard, that the 5 principles are looking at the shared responsibility for all of us, the reciprocity in intercultural integration, and not just of staff and academics, but also other students. I know we have a number of students among us today as well. We're also keen to promote and look at inclusive education practices, looking at the systemic level and questioning what needs to change. What needs to change to help all feel more welcomed. Then we are particularly keen to focus on civics and human rights education as a cornerstone to all of this. And then in the end, about action through citizenship and reimagining the citizenship for all of us. Overarching within these 5 principles is well-being and, in the end, human flourishing. And it's about what is necessary for all of us to thrive as humans. So, as you've heard, this publication illustrates the unique role that higher education institutions can have in fostering environments of mutual respect, understanding, and collaboration, particularly by actively dismantling barriers like xenophobia and cultural discrimination. Higher education institutions can serve as strategically catalytic spaces to support migrant learners to reach their full potential in engaging in a pluralistic society in which they live. So the panel discussion today is a way of celebrating this forthcoming publication from UNESCO. I'm deeply grateful to UNESCO and Lumina for their support of this publication, and I'm thrilled to be joined by colleagues from around the world here on stage to offer their unique perspectives. So let's begin, and thank you all so much for joining us here. I want to start with Fethi Mansouri, who's come all the way from Australia to join us as a UNESCO chair for comparative research on cultural diversity and social justice. Fethi, in light of the increasingly polarized debate around the value of migration, what is the rationale behind your advocacy for new ways of thinking about integration?
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you, everyone. And of course, I would like to start by thanking UNESCO and University of Stellenbosch for organizing this forum. If you see me falling a little bit asleep, it's not because of lack of interest. It's almost 3 a.m. back in Melbourne, where I came from. I only landed last night, so I'm struggling to stay awake. But again, it's no sign of any disinterest in this topic. The reason why I think your question is why we are arguing now or advocating for alternative paradigms to issues of migration and diversity governance is it's a very complicated question, but I'll try to simplify it to the audience. There are different dimensions to the whole debate on migration. There are dimensions that have to do with histories. There are dimensions that have to do with politics, and there are dimensions that have to do with policies. Focusing on politics for a moment, you know that 2024 is the year of elections. There are elections almost in 60% of the populations of the world. So 60% or more than 60% of the populations are going to vote in 2024. And of course, we've just found out about one of those elections that took place in the USA. And no need to make any comments about the outcome of that election. Let's leave that aside. But what is the common thread in a lot of those elections and those debates? If you look very closely at what's been sustaining public debates in those elections, you will find that immigration features very much near the top. A lot of those societies, a lot of those jurisdictions, if you ask the electorates, what are the top 3 issues that are really impacting your thinking or your decision to vote one way or another, migration will be one of them. And unfortunately, a lot of those opinions, a lot of those views, if you like, a lot of those attitudes are driven by myths about migration. And here comes the dimension of history and policy. There are a lot of myths about migration. I live and work in Australia, and I've been there for the last 3 decades. And in Australia, we've had a policy that we called the White Australia policy, which was only disestablished in the 70s. And that White Australia policy is essentially an immigration restrictive policy. So we used to take people on the basis of the color of their skin, where they come from, the extent to which they spoke English or not. And we implemented that policy so that only certain people could come to Australia. And the political leaders of the time framed that debate around the yellow peril. So we looked at Asians as being yellow, and we looked at them as being a threat to Australian society. Now that policy approach is one of the approaches, Dala, that we have associated, we termed as a scholars, as a diversity governance approach. That is an expectation that migrants must assimilate. So when they come to us, they must become like us. So they must forget their cultural repertoires, their cultural systems, and basically embrace what we as a society, as a majoritarian society, would project upon them in terms of values and in terms of expectations of how people need to operate and behave to integrate. That system lasted or was kept alive until the mid-70s. So what happened in the mid-70s, and now we start to talk about the alternative paradigms, is we moved from an assimilationist approach to migration and migrant integration to a system that came in the wake of the civil rights movement. Let's remember that. A very emancipatory global movement which wanted justice, which wanted human rights, and wanted decolonization of the global south. That system is what we later called as multiculturalism. And what multiculturalism did is really allow a space for the recognition of different cultures, for the recognition of diversity. And not only recognition, so multiculturalism wanted to do more than recognition, which is support minority cultures brought to those societies by migrants, support them to actually be retained and to be a dimension of those migrants' identities. Now, moving on to the recent approach, which is meant to either supplement, that is replace, or at least add to multiculturalism. And that's the work that Dala is interested in, which is the intercultural approach. So the reason why we said, yes, multiculturalism was good, but multiculturalism had some problems, is if assimilation was a denial or suppression of diversity, people felt that multiculturalism was an overemphasis of diversity. It really only worked on the assumption that people wanted to have recognition of their collective rights around cultural recognition at the expense of building bridges vis-a-vis the other groups and vis-a-vis the majority society. And that's where the intercultural approach comes in. And so the intercultural approach has certain dimensions to it, but critical to it, the intercultural approach is what we call the relational dimension. That is that me as an individual must absolutely try to engage, to build contacts, build exchange, get to know other people, and vice versa. So the bidirectionality or the multidirectionality that we speak about. But that is only, so that is the core feature of this new approach, and which became extremely powerful in Europe since 2008. But that's not the only thing about the intercultural approach that is extremely important. So in addition to contact, exchange, and dialogue, which are the three key components of the intercultural approach, there is a normative dimension, and normative is an academic term, but to break it down, there is an emphasis on rights, on justice, on things to do with equality, right? So without that, the relational is not meaningful. Then there is a third one, which is equally important, which is the transformative dimension of the intercultural approach. And what we mean by transformative is that we all change as a result of being exposed to diversity. So we all transform the way we think. We all should be impacted by being exposed to different ways and different ways of being, living, and thinking, and interacting. And the fourth one, which is extremely important in relation to diversity, is the integrative dimension of the intercultural approach. And by that we mean how it impacts social cohesion, how it impacts how we are able to make a life for ourselves within these new environments. And so the intercultural approach, with its, remember, the relational, with its transformative, with its integrative, and its normative dimensions, really offer a new paradigm whereby we're not denying or suppressing diversity, we're not overemphasizing it at the expense of integration, but what we are saying is we need a system, we need a policy framework that not only expects, and this has been said already repeatedly, not only expects migrants to come in and adapt, adhere, and conform to what majority society expects of them, but we need a social policy framework around diversity and migration that also demands that institutions within the state, that structures within the state, that interpersonal relations within the state also adapt to that new diversity that's coming through migration. And just to, I'm not sure whether I've already exceeded my time, which is only 3 minutes, but what I want to, for someone who's falling asleep, I think you can indulge me for a little bit. For a society like Australia, where we are now, for the first time in our history, a migrant majority society. We are a migrant majority society. Think about it for a minute. 52% of Australians are either born overseas or at least have one parent who's born overseas. For a society like that, it's not enough to say that we are a multicultural society. You must say that we function as a multicultural state that supports diversity with all that that requires. So maybe I'll leave it at that, unless you...
Thank you very much for very adequately responding to the question, particularly in helping us understand some of the differences between the traditional approaches that have been used in the past, particularly in Australia around assimilation and multiculturalism, and how important it is now to move to more the intercultural integration approach. One follow-up question for you, though, that I'd be curious to hear your response to is, if you could explain perhaps a bit more about how higher education institutions themselves are strategically kind of placed for advancing this intercultural integration in terms of even supporting their impact on wider communities and policy and innovation and directing public debate around this.
Yeah. Universities ought to be really more than microcosms of the broader society, because universities are places of learning and knowledge, and they are places where we can push the boundaries in terms of what we can do. And so if we have a problem at universities in terms of how refugees or international students are going to be integrated within the scholarly community first, and then the broader community second, then there is no hope for the rest of society, to be honest with you. And let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. If international students come to us, and my university in Australia, Deakin University, we have 20 to 25% of our students coming from abroad. So that's Chinese and Indians and African. We have an increasing number of African students, South Americans, Middle Eastern, et cetera, et cetera. And I had and I'm not sure whether it's a privilege or maybe I made a mistake, where I chaired the University Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and I chaired it for 2.5 years, and then I moved on. And the reason why I moved on from that particular task is because I wanted the university, that's not only Deakin, 40 universities in Australia take the same approach, more or less. And that approach is extremely driven by what I call an HR approach to diversity governance. An HR meaning that you tick boxes, yeah? So do we have basic infrastructure? Yes. Do we allow for the provision of certain types of foods? Yes, we do that. So people get a satisfaction by just ticking boxes very superficially. But actually what needs to happen is much more than that at universities. What needs to happen is a curriculum that genuinely reflects diversity. Teachers and lecturers and professors who, in their own approach to teaching, are able to have that cross-cultural competence, that allows them to think differently, that allows them to put themselves in the position of others when they talk about certain topics, right? That allows them to understand that learning takes place differently in different cultures, that people from different societies and communities have different ways of managing information flows or articulating certain positions. that the leadership itself of the university and the staff profile of the university is reflective of that very diversity. And I was talking to my colleagues and I told them the Australian Human Rights Commission, for instance, did a survey of executive leadership in Australian universities, which I just told you earlier, it's a migrant majority society now. And guess what we found? 98% of senior leaders in Australia have the same profile, white males. Does that mean that 52% of Australians who are like me and Chinese and Indians and whatever are not capable of actually rising to that level? No, of course not. There are other institutional, other structural barriers to those people actually being able. So I see universities that are actually being ideally placed to push the boundaries, to actually ensure that we show the rest of society, we show other institutions, other organizations, how you can do diversity differently in a way that is inclusive, that is empowering, that is agentic, and that is representative. And of course, democratic.
Thank you very much. So we go from the migrant majority population of Australia to Uganda. So we'll make a fast trip. And I want to turn to Philip Opuli from Makerere University and ask, within the Ugandan context, what do you see as the most pressing challenges in fostering intercultural integration of migrants there? And might there be some examples of, maybe even successful examples you think are promoting those goals of intercultural integration in your region?
I'm not so sure about the success and how you measure it. But yes, sorry. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Rafaela, for getting in touch, and it's been a while. Yeah, but the point that you raise, Uganda is a net importer of refugees. The numbers are really quite staggering. 1.7 million refugees, 55% from South Sudan and about 30% from DRC. Our policy on refugees has been known since the Second World War, when we first got some Polish refugees who came from Europe, and we hosted them. So that has also informed the kind of refugee policy that we have. And here we are talking about migration, not the normal migration. We are really talking about people who are looking for asylum and as refugees, basically. So in my university, Makerere University, which is 102 years old, one of the oldest universities on the continent, we've been having foreign students, not the normal foreign students. There are not many, but we do have. And there are quite a number of things which I cannot. Number one is things to do with funding, the cost of higher education. We used to have very interesting, when I attended university as an undergraduate, I didn't pay. The government paid for me. It was free. But then we got into structural adjustment, World Bank, IMF, and then they said, look, we have to cost share. So subsequently, even that now has been removed. There's no cost sharing. Now you pay. Because the cost of higher education, they say higher education is a privilege. It's not a right. So it becomes very difficult for migrant students who are refugees to pay. So that's the first thing which I've noted. The second thing is to do with the culture of these institutions, especially my university, where we require that you speak the language, which is English. The language of instruction is English. But second, also the accreditation of qualifications. If you want to come and do your graduate school, for example, whether PhD or master's, but mostly we get people who want to do master's. We equate their qualifications. And these are people who are coming from South Sudan, Somalia, DRC. It's very difficult even to get that equation from the National Council of Higher Education, because the idea is that the standards are not the same. So to get entry becomes very, very difficult, especially if you're a refugee or if you're a migrant. Then the other thing is to do with affirmative action. We do have affirmative action, programs for women. I remember when I was joining university, when we finished high school, because we wanted to encourage more girls to join university, so they are given extra points. They are given 1.5. In fact, there are those ones who are called 1.5, entries, because they add on to the ladies. But for the migrants, they don't have that affirmative action. We don't admit because you are an immigrant, certainly not, which of course they find very problematic because some of these people will never gain entry unless they get those extra points. So language qualifications, the issues of culture. The other thing which I wanted to mention is the participation of in the day-to-day activities of the university. We are not, as I said, there are not so many foreign students in my university. Partly because also it's also a question of culture. We have been a university which we are now moving away to become a research institution, which means that we are going to teach less and less of undergraduate courses. So we want to get into become a research university. So which would means undergraduate students will have to go to other universities, so we will do the graduate one. But that in itself also becomes very problematic because where are these people going to come from? We do have now new universities, but it's very difficult in those universities because the concentration of the professors and all these other people are in the public universities. So this is very problematic for migrant students. But having said that, the issue of the good practices that you are mentioning, the examples, I have seen pre-university language training. So now that is being offered. So when the students come, for example, in the DRC, they speak French. But increasingly, because the language of integration, we are integrating as East African countries. We are 8 now in the regional arrangement. So one of the languages, well, we have adopted languages. So it's English, French, and I think Swahili also has been added on. So the language of instruction has been expanded. So if you're coming from the DRC and you know Swahili, then you'll get instruction at the university. So the pre-university language training, that's the first thing. The second thing is sharing living spaces. We do have university managed accommodation. And in that accommodation, you can be attached to any of the halls. I think we have 7 halls of residence. So you'll be attached to a hall of residence, which means that most likely, if you are a foreign student, you'll be living with someone who is a local, or a local person will be living with a foreign student. The other thing which I would mention here is so sharing living spaces, increasingly also the affirmative action in terms of people who have disabilities, especially the refugees who come or asylum seekers who come who are disabled. Those now also they have a special way on how they can enter the university through mature entry. There are quite a number of programs which have been adopted by the university. So, and then lastly also curriculum development. We are increasingly also consulting as stakeholders. When we are developing curriculum, we also consult the foreign students. What do they want us to include, especially in terms of the new debates, in terms of some of these disciplines. So this is what we are trying to do at my 102-year-old university.
We really appreciate you sharing those examples of some of the efforts being made to welcome the migrant learners and vulnerable populations to your institution. One other follow-up question for you. Based on the publication that we're launching, More Than Welcome highlights the transformative role of intercultural integration across all aspects of higher education, including research, kind of looking at the whole ecosystem. And in your view, from your experience, what are your thoughts about how universities can embed that intercultural integration focus into research agendas, particularly ones that might eventually impact societal outcomes as well?
I think in terms of doing research, again, I will also speak on my university because we do things which tend to be traditional. We don't really explore. So there are some of these research topics which are off limits. Let me put it this way, off limits. And this is what we were discussing earlier on. If you come to my university and you're trying to do something on EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, it would be very difficult even to get the ethical clearance. Why? Because these issues, EDI is associated with the sexuality, and we do have laws. For example, we have a very stringent law which has just been adopted on anti-homosexuality. You could have heard of it. It's very, very stringent. So if you get a student who wants to do something on that, it would be very, very difficult even to get that ethical clearance. So I think as a university, and as Prof has said, it should be beyond buildings. It should be able to do things out of the world. I mean, you can explore some of this stuff. But if our universities cannot do that, then it becomes very problematic, and hence we need to change. And if we are saying that, for example, my university want to move into a 21st, our vision for the 21st century is to be a research institution, a research university, then there shouldn't be topics which are off limits. But right now it's very, very restrictive. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we should also be able to, as institutions, to this cross-pollination of ideas, because we should be able to learn from others. But if the idea is that just we only look at things in a very small prism, which we normally now tend to do as, for example, my university, then it becomes very, very problematic. I think we cannot. So we have to integrate these ideas into our curriculum. Now, one of the things which also have been done is to have cross-cutting issues. For example, now, if you come to my university, you have to, gender is a cross-cutting issue. So you start from the first year, second year, third year, you'll be doing gender. Issues of development are also cross-cutting. Issues of language, communication, it's also now cross-cutting. So which means that everybody will have, whether you are doing medicine, whether you are doing engineering, you'll have also to do gender. You'll also have to do things to do with language, which I think is very, very good in terms of having an all-round graduate. So these are some of the things which I think would have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've been looking at intercultural integration through higher education, which is part of the focus of the publication. And we now want to turn our attention to looking at intercultural integration within higher education and possibly even the pipeline of education, given the expertise of our next two panelists. So we want to go now to Veronica Boyce-Wancia and to have you reflect on the strategic importance of equalizers for migrant populations, and more than welcome highlights some of those educational settings that serve in this way. From your work with younger migrant students, could you tell us some more about some of the most effective ways you've seen that help younger students' participation in schools as an avenue for intercultural integration, and perhaps how some of those strategies can be adapted at the higher education level?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lala, and thank you, Iwan and Rafaela, for the incredible invitation, and to all of you for taking time to think together about some of these pressing issues. If I'm a little bit sleepy, it's because perhaps like many of us who have a base in the United States, we've been trying to follow and trying to survive the elections that just unfolded and that are incredibly relevant for the conversation that we're having, right? So in thinking about higher education, I couldn't help, and in thinking about democracy, I was saying I couldn't help but thinking about sort of my own experience. I grew up in Argentina, and I came to age in a time in which democracy was just starting in Argentina. So the University of Buenos Aires, entering the University of Buenos Aires at the time, was really entering a world in which the whole movement the whole idea of creating from the rubbles a new society was permeating the mission of the university. and therefore the mission that we developed for ourselves as young people, understanding that the generation above ours had disappeared, that many of the intellectuals that had been at the university before were just coming back. And this was a place of thriving, a place in which our identities were formed, and a place in which our commitments for the long term of inclusive societies, more democratic societies, was born in important ways. So my colleague Howard Gardner just finished a study of higher education and the intention, that sense of purpose that young people across the United States have about what it means to go to the university. And he finds that young people go to the university either because of inertia, finish high school, therefore next step is university, because of an exchange pact of I'm going to get a degree, so therefore I do my homework, finish my courses, and then university give me my accreditation, or because of an intention of really experiencing a transformation and understanding that the university is a place of transformation. And so young students, students tend to move, in good universities, tend to move from the earlier intentions to more sophisticated, more transformative intentions. And in that sense, I think that universities are incredibly well positioned for that reflective nature, for being the places where, as you were saying before, where the inequities of societies, hate discourse and so forth play out, and therefore also the place in which critical reflectivity about these forms of interaction need to take place. So I'm imagining universities in which the world is in the university as a topic of constant reflection and as a way of advancing better societies, better human beings, and better possibilities for dialogue and interculturality. So the problem that we have with migration, and I take my hope from the fact that that the most important innovations in education came out of moments of crisis. So in an optimistic take, I'm thinking this might be a moment for really important innovations, and I think that the piece that you're co-authoring, Darla, is very much in that direction. So when it comes to migration, I think that, like you, Darla, in your piece, that migration really presents an incredible opportunity for us in education. And it's an opportunity to challenge the assumption of homogeneity in which our educational systems are built. Whether primary school, secondary school, universities, the assumption is that there's a linguistic homogeneity, a cultural homogeneity, a religious homogeneity, if you wish. It's sort of assumed as the white version of, the systemically embedded in our laws, and that needs to be profoundly challenged in the sense that it represents students who have other languages or who come from other places, other cultures, as deviations from the norm, as the problem of the student who does not understand English or who doesn't have the resources to participate. So when we flip this question and we think about, really the problem is not that the students cannot participate in our universities, the problem is that our universities are not ready. We don't know yet how to serve all of our students. So when we flip the problem to our institutions and we see that as an opportunity for us to rethink fundamental issues, the work that we do in pre-collegiate education that I think applies perfectly well to collegiate in many ways, is there are a few key invitations, and I'd like to describe three. The first invitation is the invitation to rethink who our students are. Before the massive migratory movements that are changing the demographics of our classrooms, perhaps it was a little bit easier to imagine the private life of our students. Perhaps we could imagine, because of a question of cultural proximity, that what it was like to grow up in the household, what kinds of conversation might happen at the dinner table around these students' lives. Today, our educators cannot imagine that anymore because they're not prepared. So therefore, we have all sorts of problems of exclusion, problems of lack of attention, problems of students learning that they need to leave their culture at the door of the school before they enter, because what these students bring is invisible to unprepared educators. And this is not the fault of educators, it's simply that times are changing and we need to learn how to do this differently. So we may think about our students and our learners in multiple ways. One, that migrant students, writ large, immigrant origin learners, are diverse. And Sara, you were talking about this, I'm a migrant, learner and a migrant scholar, and the children with whom I work are sort of refugees, from asylum-seeking families. So we have very, very different experiences, and we need to recognize that. Another important thing about rethinking our students is thinking them in ecological context. And this is coming out of the Bronfenbrenner ecological views on psychology, which has to do with the fact that these students have relationships that are very immediate, but they're also permeated by the media accounts, are permeated by the institutions in which their parents participate, whether they have jobs, don't have jobs, the level of, the questions of documentation and undocumentation. So these contexts that are societal contexts go well beyond our class on Introduction to Sociology or our class. Actually, they give meaning and context to our class on Introduction to Sociology or chemistry or so. So really the visibility of these cultural assets, so to speak. And the question of asset becomes particularly important because one of the qualities that our immigrant students or migrant students bring, and we all sort of tend to have in one form or another, is this capacity to straddle between cultures. So straddling between languages, adjusting the language, the way we speak, the way we interact to a variety of cultural contexts. And this happens at the macro level in the sense that, students with whom I work may come from Guatemala and then they speak a little bit of, a lot of Spanish in some ways and interact in some forms in the barrio. And then at the same time, when they come to school, they need to learn how to adjust. And so this straddling across cultures is a competence that is incredibly important, not only from that migrant students develop very vividly, if you wish, but also for all of our students. So the question is, if we rethink who our learners are, considering the diversity of experiences, the ecological context in which they live, the rights that they have as children or as young people, and the capacities in the sense of an assets sort of view, then we might be sort of able to really respond to and make visible what young people bring to our classrooms. There are two notions that I think migration sort of invites us to rethink is the nature of learning. And this has to do with the opportunity to think about not only the disciplines that we teach, but also the habits of mind that seem to be particularly important for the kind of people that we will need in order to get along better and live together a little bit better. The habit, or as we call it, the disposition of curiosity and inquiry about other people's experience. The disposition of habit of taking perspective empathically and with an inclination towards solidarity when interacting with others. The disposition, as you have in your in the report, Darla, of participation and becoming change agents. So I think that these dispositions, what's interesting for us, in education, and particularly with an angle on psychology, anthropology, and and education, is that the dispositions are learned not by teaching explicitly as much as by enculturation. So the idea that we become the air we breathe in the institutions where we live. So as we walk into a classroom, and this is something that a teacher can do, a faculty can do, as we walk into a classroom, we walk into a meeting room, we walk into an office, what are the messages that the environment is sending about whose voices matter? Who are the model human beings that are represented there? What is the language of me, you, or us? How are these forces that are part of the construction of a culture of a classroom, microcultures of classrooms, and they are in our hands as educators? How can we design environments so that our young people and ourselves have an opportunity to make our humanity, our dignity, our diversity visible and interact with that? So I'd say that those are perhaps three ways forward.
That's very helpful to hear some of those ways forward. One other question for you in terms of looking at this pipeline of younger migrant students heading to higher education institutions. Are there some ideas that come to mind about ways these higher education institutions can better support their transition into higher education?
I think there's the variety of really sort of interesting and successful, meetings, preparations, courses that are about the cultures of higher education, language preparation, if you wish. I'm intrigued by one that I don't know if it will work. But it's this idea that that in the transition to higher education, young people have an opportunity, perhaps before they begin their studies, to understand the phenomenon of migration and put their own experience in the larger context of the history of all of us that began close to your hometown, right? So many, many years ago. And really understand this phenomenon that we're all experiencing so that migration doesn't become like the outlying, the excluding experience, but really sort of a little bit more finding sort of the commonalities across, that migration, that kids come to, or young people come to understand that, that as the children put it, that children with whom I work put it, that to migrate means to learn to belong to many places. So it's a very profound idea. It took me 10 years of living in the United States until I somewhat, came to that conclusion. So there are empowering stories about learning about the phenomenon of migration and putting oneself in that context that I think would be really interesting to experiment with.
Thank you very much. So we've heard from, yes, please thank Veronica. We've heard from 3 different perspectives around the world, and now we're going to bring it home to South Africa. And I want to turn to Fumani Kanari and ask you a similar question, given your work in supporting the integration of vulnerable children into higher education institutions. What do you think are some of the most important institutional policies that institutions can enact to help facilitate these processes of intercultural integration for migrant students?
Thank you so much, Dala and Rafala, for the opportunity. Let me declare first to say, I just moved to Cape Town in April this year. So I'm intentional. I'm not saying I'm migrated. So people will tell me I'm a migrant worker, but I said I just moved. So I'm intentional to use the language. And my colleagues have already explained some of the pull and the push factors, and they seem to be similar across, but context matter. Let me start with a lighter note that in South Africa, we are celebrating 30 years of democracy. So that's one celebration, stepping stone towards addressing issues, including the issues of intercultural, multicultural, and multilinguistic population. And that's one stepping stone for me to set the tone. But when you look at the dominant narrative in the context of celebration, it was the issue of migration. Mm-hmm. It was the issue of economic issues. So again, it was the point of, are we still in the celebration? Are we still understanding democracy? Are we still understanding living together, but to really people first? And this goes to the issue of we cannot talk about multiculturalization or interculturalization without addressing the issue of economic emancipation, because those are some of the factors that drive migration. And so I just wanted to set the tone to say why we're celebrating, there are existing issues that we still have to take into context. And part of that celebration also, from the education perspective, it was the fact that within the 26 universities that we have, public universities that we have, some were regarded as previously disadvantaged, and some are or were advantaged. So that was part of the celebration, to reflect again, to say, where are we? Are we now better off in the context of celebration as higher education? Those who were previously disadvantaged, now they got access. And what does that access mean to them? So all this ongoing discussion that needs to take place in a space of higher education. Now, coming to your question, I think recently, because 2019, it's quite recent, but not that recent, just before the pandemic, the South African Department of Higher Education and Training introduced the 2019 policy framework for internationalization for higher education as a process or as a pathway to address the issues of internationalization, issues of intercultural, as dimensions to measure what the quality, are we doing well? And we see this being factored in the rankings. Some of the universities which are ranking high is because of the international students that have been in the institution. Some are deliberately encouraged to come and study. So there is that pull factor towards internationalization, and at the same time motivating people to migrate. So we have that policy, but the question is to what extent do we address the issue of intercultural competence, or we just put it under very global phenomenon, very problematic, the issue of globalization and internationalization. So I think that policy for me is very important, really, to look into it as higher education and to interrogate the issue of quality, because it gives us points. So these are international students, but some have been deliberately encouraged to migrate, actually, so that we can benefit out of that. So migration is not only from the deficient thinking, like my colleague said, to say we see them as assets, So what do we see in this? Do we see them as assets or only from the deficient perspective? Yeah. So that's one of the policies. And another one, which is quite interesting in South Africa, we just got the Bella Act. I don't know how many people know about the Bella Act, but I don't know if it's a British, African languages, but it has to do, no, it's not. But the Bella Act, which is now been passed into law, which is an act to valorize, to appreciate, and also to use the African languages in the context of higher, or in the context of education. But I don't know if it has already taken hit in the conversation in higher education, but from my faculty, especially at UWC, we had a quorum, we had every Tuesday, we have seminars, and a few weeks ago, we had discussions around the Bella Act. We even invited the student into the space. It was actually very interesting to learn about the controversies and the resistance and the hope. I think, again, the dominant narrative is about, no, it's not going to work. So I think the issue of policies and institutional policies are still informed about some of the perceptions, some of our fears, which have been informed by the deficit thinking, instead of seeing it as an opportunity to learn. But of course, there are many issues to that. But I'm saying from the on point, the deficiency to say, okay, what does this policy mean? From the dream of democracy, from the dream of Agenda 2063, where we want to be an inclusive society, inclusive Africa. But for me, it was that narrative, the dominant narrative of fear. We don't have capacity, we are not ready, and all those are the deficiencies. We only see deficiencies, okay? I saw there were also protests already. We are protesting against that act. And so while policies are there, our institutional policies are there, but for me, it goes down to the mindset to say, what are we doing, and do we have a dream? What is this dream? And so besides that, we have, you said, how can we? Then we need to support the linguistic policies, because when we have our migrant student or student who come from other countries or provinces, like you said, it's a typical example. We struggle with language, but are we creating an enabling environment? How do we receive the policies or the language policies? How do we receive that? You know, we take each other to court because of the language policy. And yes, it's all those issues of what? Of intercultural, because we need to be engaged in from the formation or from the conceptualization of these institutional policies, because people end up being at the crossroad because of the level of engagement or lack of engagement. So for me, the issue of language policy is one of them. The policies of teaching and learning, there's no way that we cannot engage with the policies of teaching and learning if we really want to address all these issues from the inclusive perspective. And I'll make a typical example of the teaching and learning policies, you know, and I'll use a classroom, for example. Those who have been in accounting, I was an accounting teacher at one point, and I look at the textbook, and the textbook, every time it's Mr. Smith and Sons started a business. Mrs. Smith is a bookkeeper. Mr. Smith bought a car. So we need textbook analysis, because the language and the portrayal of Mr. is the one who can start a business, and the sons. Mrs. Smith and daughters can be bookkeepers and cleaners. So if you teach, or if you think about the career mapping of those learners, they don't see Mrs. Smith buying a car, you know. So I think for me, the issue of teaching and learning policies, it's one of those policies that we need to address, because from the institutional policies, then we are able to enact those. I see people are smiling all the way, but that's a fact. And I'll make a typical example again. Those who teach or who use storytelling. And there was a scenario where somebody was reading to the learners, and the story was about Titanic, and the ship, and the ship then was in danger. And one learner got frustrated because he was thinking about the animal. So when you say, and the ship was in danger, without using the visual methodologies, you know, the issues of teaching and learning. So we need to interrogate the teaching and learning documents and institutions in order to engage with all and ensure that inclusivity is not just a fad. You know, it's not just a state of mind, but also we need to reflect about what is existing and how do we engage with those. Otherwise, we are reproducing the inequalities, the injustices, if we don't engage critically. So we need to look at the institutional support or policies around research. Who got funded, you know? How do we, you know, enable funding for researchers who are interested to work in these spaces, which are called hard to reach? Because we even use language that migrant learners are hard to reach, you know. So those are the policies in terms of research and funding, because if I'm interested in working with those, I'll need a lot of money. But you find, like my brother has indicated, that our committees, higher degree committees, our institutions, the bureaucracy of ethical clearance processes, one way or the other perpetuates the kind of bureaucratic research that needs to be done. So we need to look at those policies and support. You know, yes, they're hard to reach, but when are we going to reach them? You know, there are communities that contexts which are inaccessible. I cannot go there. Who's going to go there? So we need to get to those institutions in terms of the policies around research and enable research to work with people who are interested to go to those hard to reach. But we make it very difficult in terms of accessibility and even support, because already it's hard to reach, but I want to go there. How do you assist me to get there? instead of making it difficult. Hence why I'm saying when we look at those policies, they're already existing, but how we now want to strengthen. Hence this report and this kind of launch is very important, because we now need to engage in dialogues and do research. And lastly, on that issue of research, I would say, now how do we do research with migrant learners? Do we do research with or about them, without them? So again, it goes to the issue of our methodologies. We are still, again, stuck in the conventional methodologies where we want to do research about or on them instead of doing research with them. So the policies of assessment, again, who do we assess? You know, I like the Zulu greeting. They say, "Sawubona, I see you. Do you see me?" You know, when you work with me, you know, so the issue of prior learning. So we need policies on prior learning, because I can bring that issues in the space, sawubona, but in real sense, it means, or pure translation, I see you, but you really see me. You know, so those are some of the discourses in terms of institutions. So I think the policy on prior learning is already existing in some of the universities, if not all. But I think those are some of the policies that needs to be strengthened, or we need to reflect on. And obviously, lastly, but not, I would talk about the student support. Everywhere you go, we got policies around student support. And again, the experiences, a lot of migrant students, they're working hard, they're wanted, but at the same time not wanted, you know, because they work hard because they know that they don't have so much, they have little, and they work hard, they complete their studies on time, but now we know when they're wanted, then they will meet the criteria, the university will meet the criteria in terms of our scores of internationalization, but they are competitive at the same time. Should we blame the local people? No, we need to engage, because once they're competitive, they do what? They stand a better chance of getting the job, you know. So they become unwanted to their peers, and that starts a new sense of war. So when we look at promotion policies also, we should start from how they got in here, you know, and how they navigated the space to be competitors. So when we have them, do also see them as competitors. What can we do for our local students, you know, to be at par, or to learn from them how to become resilient, like my colleagues had indicated, the issue of you know, cultural competency. So if they got that resilient and they work hard, time management, how can we use that and as an exchange project with our local student? So for me, the issues of around promotion and policies around promotions, they should also be some of the documents or issues that we need to engage from the perspective of the migration or cultural competence.
And you actually already answered the follow-up question I had for you in some ways, but I don't know if you have further responses on that. But you had mentioned about the importance of creating inclusive environments, and you mentioned a number of policies and ways that could be done. And I was going to ask, from your experience, what can universities, or how can universities cultivate that sense of shared responsibility across both migrant and local students, because that shared responsibility piece is so important in the publication around one of the principles. But you also mentioned already about the importance of ICU as being so important, and local students can do that as well for the migrant students, in addition to the faculty and staff. But I don't know if you had anything further to add to that or not.
No, okay, no, thank you. Yeah, you said the issue of creating enabling environment and shared responsibilities. It's about engagement. We already have a lot of activities which are intentional to address issues such as heritage, but from that celebratory, I think for me, what always comes to my mind is, okay, we have celebrated, then so what? you know. So how do we translate these celebrations into our day-to-day practices in the sense of inclusion, you know? There are a lot of hidden agendas, corridor talks that we take for granted, you know, because those corridor talks are very powerful spaces. So when we talk about enabling spaces, for me, it's not only the issue of classroom, you know, it's the issue of spaces which are not regarded as creative spaces, but for me, those are important dialogues that need to take into space. If somebody said, I had somebody talking about you in the corridor, so can you see that corridor, it becomes a cornerstone of the discussion. So how do you bring those unwanted spaces into your classroom, into your engagement with whatever the forum that you are? Yeah. So again, the issue of self-study. You know, as practitioners, as researchers, we need to engage into self-study. We need to engage into asking ourselves deeper questions. Hence, there's quite a dominant research on self-study nowadays because it's always about them. So if it's about change, it has to start with you. So those are some of shared learnings and shared experiences that we can. So the concept of creating, again, nobody has got a formula. We all should be at par and at different angles. If we see ourselves as agents of change, then we should be engaging. You cannot create and build without talking to one another. So the silences, there's quite a lot of quiet or passive activists in the space of higher education because of fear, because even from the student point of view, us as lecturers or as researchers, are we creating enabling spaces? If a learner or a student is asking questions, we always say, hey, they're challenging us. They need to be challenging us, but are we ready for the young people in the space, again, of globalization, internationalization, and digitalization? They know more. So how do we create that enabling space without the fear of being intimidated? So in the space of multicultural and any other context, we need to understand to let go of power so that we can rise with somebody else. Because I think culture goes with identity, you know. So you're being positioned as the knower. And when somebody at a lower rank address some of the issues that we're not aware of, what happens? You are still stuck in the power tower instead of reducing your power and elevating somebody's power so that you can also learn from them. So the issue of self-studies challenges those powers that are existing, which needs to be re-looked and revamped and revitalized. Triple R, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we were hoping to have some time for Q&A, including from our online participants, and this was such a rich discussion with our panelists with so many fascinating perspectives. Maybe we could just take one or two questions from the audience and maybe one online. I'm looking at Werner, he's got possibilities of online there. So we have a question over here.
Hello?
Yeah, no, it's more about a comment than a question, especially in the light of the last speaker. I'm a proud parent of a student who graduated in this university 2 years ago, who is now preparing to get an employment in Australia. How I wish she could be going to Makerere University instead of Australia. I'm from the Eastern Cape. Each time I get here in the Western Cape, I'm reminded about the fact that I'm a migrant in this place. my child could not be admitted at Walter Sisulu University, where I work as a professional. It could have been better that she could stay with me and could attend at Walter Sisulu University. But because I'm middle class, I've got means, I could bring her to Stellenbosch University. Now, I hope you begin to get what I'm trying to say. This point about migration, perhaps we limit it to the notion of non-South Africans. The bottom line is that we've got migrants within the country. We've got people who have to migrate from the Eastern Cape to the Western Cape and deal with issues of power relations and materialist conditions. And not until we delineate this issue of the knower and the knowledge, as the last speaker has spoken, has alluded to, and critique our agency, the choices that we need to make to problematize knowledge as privileged, and make the point that the idea of the public good is accessible to all, not in terms of class, power, and privilege. Thank you so much, UNESCO, for this platform. I'm happy that I forced my way to be here, as I've shared with you at personal level. I commit myself to work with you, but let's work on more sustainable mechanisms to take these projects to where they belong, to the historically black and disadvantaged university, and make those people there comfortable in terms of how to engage the concept of migration. Otherwise, we'll continue to have the same discourses and debates 5-10 years from now, despite the SDG 2030 goals. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for your intervention there. And any questions online? No? Then one more here. Oh.
Thank you very much. Dala, looking at the title of the book, More Than Welcome, and listening to the talks and the contributions, and thank you very much for that. I was thinking, maybe the title should have been You Are More Than Welcome Here. And then I want to actually propose a follow-up. We are more than welcome there. Because I think there is a dynamic aspect, and it speaks to the contribution that was just made. Robert, in his introduction, alluded to that project that we are busy with the refugees. In Stellenbosch, we don't have such a massive refugee population. We've got 70-odd students. But in that project, we've got partners like Kenyatta University, Juba University, University in Mogadishu. And their role in that project is not to bring students to their institution. You are more than welcome here. It is, we are more than welcome there. And to actually go to the refugee spaces and to give the training and the education there. There was comments about accessibility challenges. But, a refugee cannot leave the camp or the space because they've got an obligation there. So I think the follow-up of this is, let us figure it out. How can we handle, and we should systems and places and frameworks together so that we can welcome refugees, get the curriculum right. But I think the next chapter is we are more than welcome there. And I'm not saying that Stellenbosch, where we are, should necessarily put up shop in the Eastern Cape. According to the International Higher Education Framework, we cannot put up shop in Uganda or so, but we can work with partners. I think that the lessons we must learn is how do we work with Makerere? How do we work with other institutions so that we are also welcome there? And we can learn from that, bring it home. I think that's the next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. And your comments certainly speak to quite a few of the principles that are talked about in the publication around intercultural integration, and that it's on all of us, and looking at it as multi-directional as opposed to just one way too. Yes, thank you. And maybe one last comment or question from our co-chair.
Hi everyone. Just a quick comment and then a question for our distinguished panel. The comment I'll make is, I think as we talk about these issues, especially the role of higher education, I think we cannot just restrict our view to students. More and more we're seeing that these issues affect faculty as well. At Stellenbosch, for example, we have a large contingent of faculty that are from elsewhere, whether that elsewhere is from another province or from another country, and usually it's from another African country. And the experiences there are quite harrowing. So this leads to the question that I have for our panel. I know that a lot of the times that we talk about this, we're coming from a deficit model because of the state of the world. But are there specters of hospitality that we can speak to as examples, perhaps beacon of hope, from your own institutions or the work that you have done around the world that you can share with the room? As I can see, there are people from many, not just faculty, people in different positioned differently in the university. We have student leaders like Hakima in front of me here. We have senior leaders in the university. But are there examples that you can share with us of hospitality within the higher education space that we can take with us almost as specters of hope?
Yes, please.
Yes, it's on now. I'll just come and give you an example of hospitality and ethics of care, also towards the other. But I want to just connect few of the key points that were made in the two other previous interventions, and say that migration, so you talked about internal migration, yeah? Which is why nowadays we increasingly like to talk about mobility, not just migration. So when people decide to move from one place to another. But even mobility is limited as a concept. And I'll tell you why. It's limited as a concept because it's not just because I move from place A to place B that I will face challenges and discriminations and inadequate curriculum and problems of integration, et cetera, et cetera. It all comes down to power. It's all about asymmetrical power relationships. We have, at my current institution, where I hope your daughter was able to come, we have, for instance, students who would come from England, from America, the USA, North America, Canada, Scandinavian countries, right? And then we also have students who come from India, China, Africa, and South America, and the Middle East. And I can tell you, their experiences are not the same. They all moved. They all made a decision to come and pay and study and talk about funding and access, etc. But their experiences, social experiences, cultural experiences are not the same. And you gave a very powerful example of someone moving from within the same country, right? From east to west or west to east, and yet they face significant challenges. So that tells you it's not about mobility itself, it's about power arrangements. It's about the power of knowledge construction. It's about the asymmetrical power between different groups. So I belong to a group which has a lot of historical privileges, and you don't. And therefore, I still have privileges even when I move from one place to another. Whereas you, even if you move within the same jurisdiction, you still have challenges and you face challenges. So unless we understand that notion of asymmetrical power arrangements that still exist in our societies, we will not really come to grips with what we need to do to, in many ways, overcome some of those issues, whether it's in relation to curriculum, whether it's in relation to support, whether it's in relation to systems and policies like funding, qualification recognition, how we train our teachers, how we open pathways for staff, for faculty staff to actually, make their way in academia in terms of access to resources. But going back to your challenge, you said give us something, an example of hospitality or hope. So there are very good initiatives that have worked very well in terms of welcoming international students or welcoming international staff. So in Australia, in my university, for example, one of the things that we did, and it worked very well, is when students come to study with us, we don't always send them to dormitories or residential areas to study. The first thing we do before they join us is we give them the option of homestays. So they actually stay with Australian families nearby the campus. The reason why that's a good idea is because it works in relation to them understanding how Australian society works, but also it opens up those families, those Australian families, it opens up their collective cultural minds to other cultures and other ways of thinking and being. And the reason why I say that's a good example, but it's limited because we don't have enough families who can, as I said, in my university, we have about 10,000 students who are international students. International students, about 10,000. And so every single year, we enroll an additional close to 9,000, 7,000 to 9,000 students. So the number, and that's just my university, one of 40 universities in Australia. So the numbers are huge. And so it works very well because it breaks down barriers, it reduces prejudice, it really allows people to broaden their own perspectives on life and on culture and on diversity. But again, unfortunately, it is limited. It works, but it is limited. One of the other things that we've done, and it works very well, is my university has created a fund for international students to access. So if you're an international student, even if you are fee-paying and you come and study, but for some reason you are facing financial difficulties, you can apply to this particular fund, which was established by the university. You can access it so that you can overcome some of those hardships and difficulties. And the reason is because we wanted to send a message that you are not just a source of international fee paying for the university. You don't just subsidize our research, because that's how it was. International fee paying students subsidize research. Research is very expensive. But you are also seen as contributor, not just to the university, but the social fabric of the country. And you contribute to the economy because they actually participate in the labor force. So that works again, but it is limited and it needs to be expanded.
Any other comments from our panelists?
Can I add, because she mentioned something on the Agenda 2063. You see, I find it very difficult as an African. The reality is not the same thing as what people say, or what people say is not the reality really. If we are going to remove borders, because this is the thing that we've been talking about, the Africa we want is an African which is integrated, which means that we don't have, we should be able to move from one place to another. I move from Uganda, I can go and sit in Kenya, a Kenyan can go and sit in Tanzania. So that kind of thing. So freedom of movement of people, goods and services, especially the question of people. But in actual fact, it's not like that. We still have borders. Borders have become barriers instead of bridges. And in the context of education, this migration thing, it's very difficult. For me to move from Uganda to South Africa, I need to apply for a visa, I don't know, for 3 weeks in advance, or I don't know. And to get it also just becomes very difficult. So you can imagine if you are a visitor, a visitor's visa should be very easy to get. But what about if you are going to work? What about your work permit? It becomes totally difficult. So this idea of this mobility thing, whether it is faculty or whether it becomes very difficult for us as Africans, especially on this continent. We are not a country, we are a continent. There are 55 countries. 55 countries. And this is something that we need to realize. But the politicians, and again, he talks about power. I don't see this thing happening because we still have borders. Borders have become barriers. But here we are talking about, a common market, and we are talking about all this stuff, and it only just remains on paper. African Union just remains on paper. In actual fact, this is very, very difficult. I don't know how we are going to address this in the context of migration. I don't know. Thank you.
Can I add?
Other comments briefly.
I'll go back to, I like because you used the bioecological system theory. And it started as ecological system, then Bronfenbrenner critiqued his work himself. Now it's bioecological. So it starts with you, so we need to be intentional. I don't have all the answers, but from the small scale that I've worked, I realized that we need to be intentional, you know. And being intentional is the issue of resilient, the self-concept. So how do we again assist young people, you know, to mobilize the inner self, which is the issue of self-esteem, self-concept, especially now in the digital space where even if you want to do something good, but the media can paint it somehow. So for me, what has worked in the small scale is really going back to the psychology of teaching, the psychology of traveling. Now I'm sure I can travel anywhere. I can go to anywhere as long as it's safe, you know. But that's a mindset, the issue of self-concept. So I always say to young people, we need to engage in raising awareness around the self-worth and the self-esteem, and they're resilient. One project that I was involved with, again, it was about, it's intentional. We had the youth exchange between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Germany, and I was one of the co-conveners. And how I got there, I didn't have funding, but I saw somebody at the conference who was presenting exactly the same research interest that I love. Then I reached out. So again, it's self-esteem, you know, and through that, we were able to write a grant proposal, and then we got that funding. So we took, it was youth exchange because again, we want to learn from each other's culture. So Zimbabwe, South Africa, we spent 21 days in Germany, and a part of the project was around cultural competences and sharing. So we didn't go to stay in a hotel. We stayed in one of the, you know, not the fancy stuff, because the mission was not about fanciness. So the next week they had to go and stay with the German parents, their peers, the same way when they came to this side, the second leg was in Zimbabwe. So German young people and their coordinators and us, we went to Zimbabwe, the same thing. And then they went to stay. And it was actually interesting, their reflection, because even in today's, you know, we are talking about 21st century, there are still people who believe that we still live in trees, you know. So some of the reflection from the German group, when they were taking pictures of Victoria Falls, you know, they couldn't believe, because again, the dominant narrative is like Zimbabweans are poor, Africa is poor, you know. But when they saw the Victoria Falls, so the messages out there was quite very controversial or contrasting the public domain. So we need to really be careful around these dominant narratives, because they perpetuate the negativity that is going along. And so I think my message for me is don't give up, be intentional, and you need support. Yeah.
We sadly need to bring this very rich discussion to an end. We want to thank all of you for being part of it, and especially a very warm thank you to our panelists. You will have the opportunity to interact more with them and with each other in just a few minutes, as we do have some fun planned after this to celebrate this publication and this event. It was interesting just to hear some of the themes that emerged. So much rich discussion just now about the role of asymmetrical power, the need to engage critically and to question assumptions and policies. the importance of designing places, environments, and policies where all belong. And in the end, coming back to something that was said in the beginning about the relational dimensions, I think that really came out, and remembering the relational part. And in the end, also for all of us, it's not about categories or labels, it's about our shared humanity. And it's important that we remember that as we move forward. So as we celebrate this publication today, let us remember that the integration of all learners is very, very important. And it's not just an educational one, but a societal one. It's about building communities where diversity is seen as a strength, as we heard in the discussions, where every student, regardless of their background, feels valued, respected, seen, and empowered to contribute. And I want to thank again UNESCO, Lumina, and all those who were involved in making this publication possible, including students and student voices. And I think we need to do a lot more in listening to our students. They have a lot to offer us. And thanks to all of you again for being here. I think this shows your dedication to building a more inclusive future for all. And so, in conclusion, we will be sending a link to this publication in the near future to all of you. And when you receive it, I want to invite each of you to read the publication, share it widely, reflect on its findings, and most importantly, take action. This is on all of us. This is all of our responsibility to be more than welcoming to all in our midst. Together, we can ensure that higher education continues to be a place of opportunity and growth for all students, regardless of their origin. And together, we can work to build a more peaceful world together. Thanks for all that you do. Thanks for being here. At this point, I'll turn it back to Rafaela.
No, thanks so much to everyone. And thanks to literally everyone that took part in this. We're heading to a cocktail now, and you're welcome to join. So thank you again.